Hi, and welcome to the OpenSkies podcast. On today's episode, we're going to meet Ryan and Liz. Liz works for a company called Embross, who is one of the leaders in self-service technology in airports. And Ryan works for WestJet, one of Canada's iconic airlines. Join us as we see how the self-service business model has changed airports and airlines across the globe. And follow us on OpenSkies podcast on LinkedIn and Instagram. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. I am with Liz Baring, account manager at Embross, and Ryan Potter, senior manager of IT airports for WestJet.
IT airline operations.
IT airline operations,
That's right.
Sorry. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you. It's
Thank
good
you.
to be here.
Excellent. So this has been in the works for a long time. Embross and myself have been talking about potentially bringing you guys on to talk about self-service and bag drop and how that kind of ties into the airline ecosystem. I had the ability to fly out one day on the launch day for Embross's new bag drop program at the Calgary airport. And I thought, what a great idea to bring WestJet and Embross on to talk about that experience and to go from there. So that's why we're here. But before we hop into how your partnership has been, let's get to know you guys. So Liz, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I've been in the industry, the travel industry. Started out my career with Northwest Airlines back in the 80s,
Okay.
a little bit before probably you were around.
No, I was born in 1980. So,
Okay, well, this was
but I
1985.
do remember Northwest.
So I started my career there and made a number of changes, spent 14 years with the airlines, and then went to another technology company providing similar hardware technologies back in the early 2000s, and just recently joined Embross, and hopefully will spend my last career days with Embross.
Excellent. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
And Ryan, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Chris. Well, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's been a long
first of all.
time.
So for people who are listening, obviously Chris and I have known each other from working
Long time.
working at the same place for quite some years. My journey has also been quite a bit of time. I started at WestJet in the dying days of 1999.
Wow.
And I always like to say that I haven't looked for a job since the 90s. Over the course of time that I've been at WestJet, I've definitely held quite a few roles, mainly in the technology space looking at airports.
Right.
Although since COVID has been around, I've definitely I've had some changes in that. I've led teams related to tech ops, flight ops, airport mobility, airline mobility, as well as airline strategy and delivery, which is what I do primarily right now.
Yeah, COVID really did kind of force
Changed
everybody to take a
everything.
bunch of titles, huh? So before we jump into the product and the integration, why self-service? I see this move so much in the industry, and I have some theories around why it's such a big thing, but I want to hear from our experts. Why the move to self-serve, and how does that benefit the consumer?
Footprint is part of it. Like I always like to tell the story about what WestJet's footprint was at Calgary Airport in 2000 versus now.
I was working the counter back then.
So back in the year 2000, as you would remember, the actual physical space that we occupied is essentially equal to what we occupy today.
Wow.
And the difference, of course, is exponential growth in flights. Like if you think back then, like, you 20 flights a day or something that was departing in Calgary Airport for WestJet, and now you're in the hundreds of flights a day. The physical space of the terminal, especially given that there are several major carriers that operate there,
Be so limiting.
is
too.
so limiting. You cannot expand to process that manually. The other large component of this is to improve the product offering that we do for our guests as well. We don't want your optimal experience to be like it was in 2000, where you got into a large queue and you sat there and waited. And yes, you did get a nice, friendly person like Chris, who would have dealt with you on the other end.
After 45 minutes.
After 45 minutes. The idea is all about throughput. And there's been a massive evolution in our thinking, which I think was what we're going to talk about today, like as far as the strategy we use at WestJet, because we went from, okay, we're going to do self-service at the beginning and sort of replicate the agent experience, but do it using a digital product. As we've moved along, we've changed that so that the actual experience for somebody who uses self-service is different than somebody who is waiting to have full service. And in our estimation, the experience you're going to get is better because it's faster, more accurate, less prone to losing your bag, for example.
Now, WestJet has been an early adopter in self-service and kind of challenged the status quo since day one with electronic boarding passes, getting rid of your actual flight ticket, and even your first self-serve bag drop. Tell me what the early days were like.
Okay, well, Liz kind of alluded to a company that she'd worked at before. That company was called Kinetics. It was out of Lake Mary, Florida. And that's how long Liz and I go back. You might recall at the time, WestJet had announced numerous times it was going to operate into the Toronto market, and then we didn't, and then we were, and then we didn't. But in that time period between 2000 and 2002, WestJet was seriously contemplating and then eventually launched into Toronto. Toronto Airport, that was also going at the same time as a transformation in the industry, like recognizing that proprietary kiosks and things that are out there. Airport authorities didn't want to have 15 kiosks for Northwest, 15 kiosks for Air Canada, 15 kiosks for
and all
WestJet,
different
things, all different experience in this, and to have a common layer of infrastructure, which had already been done from the counter position since the late 80s. So Qt, like the original version of Qt, the common use terminal equipment, was the same thing for counter operations, right?
Yeah.
So that you could have a single position that could be used by multiple airlines. In our initial days, we wanted to have a self-service product. Like we wanted to have that. You may even remember we kind of quasi had one, an OpenSkies one way back in the day. It was called
Touch and Go. And
Touch
the reason
and Go.
why I know it was called Touch and Go is my very first job was to stand in front of the Touch and Go machines.
Yes.
And the best part about it is they were closer to the Air Canada counter, so I basically directed a lot of people to the
and
competitor.
they were shaped like airplane tails.
They were great.
And the computer, like if you look at the technology inside, the computer was essentially a computer that we'd found at Burger King, of all places, that was then adopted like the screen-wise in order to process this and run some software on it. But at the time, moving into Toronto, WestJet we wanted to be self-service. We were never going to, like if you think of all the carriers that are flying to Terminal 3 at that time, space was a problem. We needed to have self-service technologies. So kiosks, and this is the time period before self-bag drops or even self-tagging was allowed.
Right.
We partnered with Kinetics, where Liz was at the time, on the construction of WestJet's first CUS, or common use self-service kiosk application, which we ran for several years. And then we got into the mid-2000s. It was time for us to make, sort of a change and the next step on what we wanted to do functionality-wise. WestJet was out for RFP. Unfortunately, Kinetics had been purchased by a different company called NCR at the time. They weren't successful in the bid. The bid was successful by IBM at the time. And WestJet, we always wanted to control our own destiny. So it's not like we wanted to have IBM write the software for us and continue to maintain that software. What we were looking for is, because there are challenges with that CUS, or common use self-service operating layer. It's not like, you're just talking to a Windows driver or something like this. You have to talk to these common use peripheral managers. We needed expertise in that, which is why we had IBM along for the ride. But the intent was they would do the initial build, hand it off to WestJet, and WestJet would continue to develop the product internal. And one of the teams that I led did that work as well, which is building on that kiosk application. As we continued on again, there was the IBM kiosk division, or at least their airport division overall, was sold and purchased by Embross. And so at that point, that's where we came full circle back. Liz came eventually back into our world because she had a short, or quite a long stint at CETA in between. But even at that time, Embross wasn't new to us, because we were always trying to push some of the boundaries. So you may have remembered we'd done some experimentation with mobile kiosks, right? And that's where, like, when I first met the people from Embross, like, it was really just a few guys, and all in a family. So Miles and Achilles, and from Australia. And like Miles would take like the kiosk itself, it wasn't like they had a full setup for shows and things like that. He would just attend as an attendee, and he would check the kiosk in a golf bag, and then
He did.
and then he would wheel it around the shop, like the trade floor. So he'd just come in to the trade show as an attendee and just wheel this thing around. And
that is fantastic.
And that's how WestJet got involved with this company called Embross. And And WestJet was really interested in something like this, like to solve some of our challenges, like especially like airports like Palm Springs and things like this,
Right.
where it doesn't have a common use infrastructure, but we don't have dedicated counter space for all the time, right? So it's not like we can just physically
Drop
core
it.
some
Sometimes
kiosks
you're
in.
at this counter.
Sometimes you're there.
Right.
So
Yeah.
these things could move around and you could use them. So we were already in with Embross. So when Embross purchased the IBM piece, we were like, okay, well, this is
Perfect.
good. But that started our next journey, which is really like that period that like before COVID. So if we're looking at like about 2018 through till now, some other major changes going across the landscape, especially in Canada and Europe. But Europe was already essentially there on two-factor authentication for payments,
Right.
the deprecation of magnetic stripe reader payment type forms, and the need to either go to a chip and pin or to some other alternate form of payment.
Right.
The challenge with that, when you look at a common use landscape across the world, is normally what would happen is like if you're McDonald's or Subway or whatever company out there, and you're going to implement kiosks in your stores and things like this, you use one acquirer. You use your acquirer because
Yeah.
you own the places where they are,
Right.
and that's your physical
You're not
hardware.
sharing with Burger King.
You're not
or
sharing with that,
Dairy
right?
Queen.
So
yeah.
you've got it, right? That's exactly what you're seeing here, which is now you have a kiosk that's shared by Air Canada, WestJet, British Airways, KLM, Air France, everybody.
Right.
Whose payment provider, because you can't use multiple acquirers on these things,
Oh, wow.
is going to be used. So it would come down to the airport authority itself would have to choose acquirer, and then you'd have to integrate to the acquirer. When we looked at it across our route network, we were going to have to integrate to probably between 15 and 20 different acquirers globally for us to continue to process payment on a kiosk. We did one, and that first one took us 18 months to get across the line. And and that wasn't because of low prioritization in WestJet or
how
anything
it
else.
took.
It's just, especially
The
when it
time.
comes to financial things,
Yeah.
it is rigid and the time frames can go quite long. So WestJet was really forced into making a choice. Like, do we want to invest all the time and the money on that and possibly not even meet the deadlines for some things and have to turn kiosks off in some airports? Or do we actually start doing a fundamental shift in how we process guests in an airport?
Yeah.
There was some, apprehension on the side of some groups inside of WestJet at the time, worried about loss of ancillary sales or things like this. Like if you removed payment from a kiosk, which was the strategy we were proposing,
Yeah.
and move that payment upstream. So you move it into the digital product. So if you're the digital check-in and the mobile app that WestJet has, that should be the place where people go to and where the guests go to in order to process anything.
Yeah.
It's also the place where you can process payment. And as long as the payment's done on those back-end pieces, then the kiosk itself no longer needs to do this. There's multiple
it's
benefits of that.
conduit, yeah.
No, you don't have to integrate to any of these acquirers. It removes that physical hardware from PCI scope, which is, for those who don't know what that is, that's payment card industry standards, stuff that you have to get certified every year on. Removes that stuff from scope. But the other added benefit is those transactions take time. And when you look at an airport, you can't just take a kiosk farm and continually expand it and expand it and expand it and expand it and expand it. Because it's taking you a minute and a half or 6 minutes or however long it's going to average take you when you're going through multiple transactions, assessing fees for baggage or for seats or for things like this.
Right.
If the person actually comes already ready, all you need to do is either spit out a tag. If they're on an international itinerary, perhaps if they haven't used, and good plug for the regular, document verification stuff in the WestJet mobile app.
Right.
If you use that, you don't even have to scan your passports at a kiosk or anything like that. But really, the kiosk itself then just becomes a tagging platform and actually moves itself into part of the bag drop infrastructure. Like at WestJet, we no longer think of that as a check-in kiosk. What we think of that is it's part of our bag drop experience. Instead of having a one-step bag drop, which is you have a bag drop machine and I process everything on that machine. Like that's
Yeah.
where I could do check-in or issue bags or collect payments and things like this. We have what I like to call 1.5 step.
Yeah.
Where the kiosk that's fronting it, because the kiosks are slimmer and over time, like especially if you're not doing a lot of full service stuff on them, you can start making those kiosks smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right.
But you can put an army of those to get the tags. Like it's essentially they just print the tags,
Bag tag.
and then you move to the bag drop, right? Because if you do it at the bag drop, and some of our studies that we looked at on this, the throughput, then you end up with a choke point there, right?
Yeah.
So if we just said, okay, well, we'll issue the bag at the bag drop, by the time you get up to the bag drop, there's only 12 to 15 units that sit there in Calgary Airport.
Yeah.
You'll end up with just clogs of people, whereas you can put more kiosks. So our strategy evolved to, we wanted it to be, to essentially replicate what agents did for our guests, to what we want you to do is use the mobile application as the primary way that you interact with WestJet, and then we use the kiosks and the bag drops in order to facilitate a faster experience for you in the airport.
And that was a big difference from the last time I used self-service, because I famously do not want to see anybody at counter. I want to get through. I have a Nexus card, so I go right through the security checkpoint as fast as possible. That's kind of my mind frame. The biggest difference was using my mobile app instead of actually using the kiosk, and the kiosk kicking me back to that. Yeah. That seemed to be like the big change. Yeah, and I quite enjoyed it. It was the only issue would be you're worried about connectivity in the airport, I would assume now is.
You definitely are.
Not so much today anymore as it used to be.
Definitely not because of the, especially if you're in a major airport in Canada, the United States, or in Europe.
You're going to have coverage.
You're going to have coverage. I get mobile coverage isn't spotty like it used to be. That becomes more of an issue in some places like the Caribbean or Latin America and things like this. And even if there isn't a mobile network that's available, like the Wi-Fi networks in some of those airports can be spotty. Yeah. But
that's a challenge we see with some of our products is some of our clients are flying to countries or destinations that don't have connectivity. So that's why we've invested in the hardware. So when you have a company like WestJet as a partner, are they unique, or are the challenges unique? Are you building a custom solution for WestJet, or is this something you're seeing across the industry and WestJet's just ahead of the curve?
Yeah, so good question. But before I get into answering your question, I just wanted to go back to Ryan. And I think the underlying, the common denominator here is that the consumer is very early on in the early stages of self-service, the consumer wasn't as willing to adopt the self-service. They didn't like the fact that they were having to do the work themselves, right? And so that's kind of where the transition and the transgression progressed over the years. It took a little bit longer because you had to start getting people used to the fact that they didn't have a ticket, that it was an electronic ticket, that they could actually physically check in without a person and get the documents that they needed. So fast forward, and to answer your question, I think WestJet has been an innovator and a leader in this space. Right. I think a lot of people look to WestJet to see what they're doing. They've definitely I think been the leader in a lot of the self-service, especially with self-bag drop. So I've got customers in the U.S. as well, and we always use WestJet as an example, saying, "Hey, you want to see how self-bag drop works? Come on, let's come to Calgary. We'll show you how it works. We'll show you how simple it is. We'll show you that there aren't the lines that we see in the U.S. Because they're it's to the point where they're mandating that that's how the passenger checks in. They don't give them an option anymore to check in at the airport. So.
It is, and that is a struggle for a company to overcome, especially one like WestJet where it's very people focused. Like if you considered probably at least the first 20 years of our company, it would be the strength is the people, right? So there's an institutional reluctance and resistance to removing a guest interaction from our people, right?
Right. A touch point.
Instead of saying, well, actually, it's better because even if the people like you and me, who I don't want to see anyone, I just want to use the machines, and we get what we need, but the vast majority of people move through without any issue at all. That allows infinitely more time for the agents to be able to deal with those that actually do have some challenges, because it's not 100% of everybody is eligible. There are conditions, of course, that we have to restrict people's usage. It opens up time for those people to do it, rather than before we would have said everybody deserves and should get a good experience with a WestJet customer service agent. That's our strength, that's our brand. And that wasn't wrong, but you still had a positive
not
experience,
scalable.
but it
Right.
isn't
No.
scalable. But but it also isn't 100% right, because there are people like us and others who, like, even though I have a great experience with the WestJet agent, after waiting for 30 minutes, I didn't want to wait for 30
Yeah,
minutes.
exactly.
And I might not have had the time.
Right.
Yeah. And I think going back to your other question that you asked if we customize our solution, and really the answer is no. What we do is we start with a core application and we build it so that it's modular and flexible. So if WestJet wants to use that core infrastructure and build out their self-service program, whether it's a self-service bag drop, whether it's access to the lounge.
Yeah, like the client for the applications that we use for lounge access, for bag drop, and for kiosk is
Right.
actually the same client.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
something that's called Cuss AppLink, which is an Embross product. That's actually what's bought and licensed and sits there on each of these type of platforms.
Right.
And it controls the interface with the peripheral layer and the operating systems, and then launches a Chrome browser where the application actually then runs in.
Right.
But you can have different applications in
Right.
that, and there is some, like, compared to what we used to, like WestJet used to be we are so unique. Like, there's the way everybody else does it. No, there's the way WestJet does it, and as I'm sure you recall, and
That laugh was coming from trauma.
that's right. So it became very complicated. Like, if you went back to the mid 2000s and really into the early 2010s, that was a real struggle for us, because as a company, we're like, no, we want to do these billion things inside the application, but that's not what the application is designed to do out of the box. So we end up customizing. Then you get caught in update cycles and things like this, because software ages. We all know that, and software needs to be updated and patched and revised and things like this. And if you're not on a standard software, like the vendor that you're working with, it isn't going to provide it to you. You're going to have to engage back with them and initiate a cost on your own in order to get that updated. I'd say in the early days, yes, we were heavily customized, especially even when we were on NCR
Yeah, absolutely.
kinetic stuff. It was heavily customized. As time has gone on, year after year after year, that has disappeared from WestJet, and definitely from our strategy and philosophy perspective, at least on the technology side and digital sides now, is to move to out of box, right?
Yeah.
Like, that is the only way we
Go
can
to a
sustain
software
this.
company
Right.
that makes software, and
Yeah.
that's it, or
Well,
a hardware or software company.
And
Yeah.
we're seeing more of the airlines who, back to WestJet's point, they wanted to customize everything. Everything needed to be customized. Today, they're like, how can we customize this as little as possible? We don't have the resources to support these applications
Right.
anymore, but we need to find a way to differentiate ourselves.
Yeah.
So there might be some branding differentiators, but for the most part, if you look and you open the kimono, if you will, this stuff is the same as the core.
Yes.
Right.
Like,
So-
if you look at ours, like for those applications, like the core of our application, for example, is the same as like Delta's or whoever else's, right? There's some scanning and stuff that's there. The differentiator for airlines now, and it goes back to like our earlier discussion on moving application functionality into the mobile app, that's where you control your differentiator,
Yeah.
right? So you can do whatever you want, and everybody's mobile app to airline is completely different. They all have some key things that are in them, but
They'll
that's
kinda
where
feel the same.
they would feel the same. But
Yeah.
but you can control whatever you want to do from a unique experience there, where you actually control the development teams. You're not using, a bespoke technology platform, which is like processing in airports, whether that's Community self-service or Qt systems or things like this, that is highly bespoke to the airline industry. It's not like you can go off the street and try to find a developer who understands this
Right.
stuff. It takes years to bring somebody up to speed on that. So control it in the mobile app, where that's just standard stuff that we do in technology organizations. And then what you're finding as time goes on, and Liz was correct, like areas of the world are at different stages of this evolution. Like the European, like Asia's ahead, usually the same as Europeans, and sometimes even slightly ahead, because they'll do some unique things. Europe is usually the gold standard on what is happening when it comes to self-service. Canada's usually three to 4 years behind when it comes to regulatory and adoption and the type of technologies you're seeing. And the United States is about a decade behind Europe. And it's not because of lack of that. Like, the United States is the trauma from 9/11 and what that did to the security landscape. anybody who works in aviation knows, like once a government puts in a rule, it's very, very difficult to get the government, regardless of how ridiculous the rule is now.
Yeah.
It's very hard for the government to remove the rule. And in the United States, you had that. Like there was so much concern in the wake of 9/11, which justified at the time, because not like every airport had whole bag screening or anything like that at the time.
No. The facilities just weren't there back
They
then.
just weren't there, but they are now. They were within like 2 years of 9/11.
Yeah,
and,
quick.
But the rules were never revisited, right? So then it became a lot more problematic. So in the United States now, you find carriers, like if you look at Alaska or American or Delta or Spirit or any of these carriers, their journey right now where they are on bag drops or kiosk and what they want to do as far as their self-service model,
right,
more reflects about Canada about 10 years ago. But for us, it works out. Like like at WestJet, I do speak to Embross's customers, some other customers, mainly the American ones who are interested in this, like as Liz was alluding to. When Embross brings them up here, I'm happy to showcase, what we've done, and if some of those other carriers can learn from some of our missteps and just take a look at the data that we've done, it may help them. Like Alaska, I know was very excited. Like when they wanted to go down the same route of removing ancillary sales collection from kiosk, for example, as WestJet. But they're like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Like, there's no way I'm going to be able to sell this to the executive at Alaska. And then
and if Alaska's having trouble with that, how can a Spirit or
right?
It must be even harder for those ultra low cost airlines where their bread and butter is that airport charges, that airport ancillary revenue. So they must be even more nervous.
They are, because some of those models they work on differential pricing, whether or not you're purchasing in advance of coming to your airport versus coming to an airport. So you can continue to do stuff at airports. You're just going to have to accept that, you're going to have heavy PCI regulations around what you do, certifications. You're going to have to move your applications to chip and pin or other forms of payment. You can continue to do that, or you can make the investment and move that to your mobile app. But when you're doing that, like if you're a Spirit or even if you're a Flair or something like this, where you use that type of model with differential pricing, you may have to just rethink that when it comes to it. Like maybe just have it as a time trigger. Like you can still do it. Just always push your payments to the application, but make it as a time triggered piece, right? But,
interesting. So here at Flight, when we introduce a client to a new product, it's super important that our launches go seamlessly, right? We're putting hardware on aircraft and then turning it on and getting all the regulatory stuff. What is it like, Liz, from your perspective, when you're launching a new product? What do you take into account, and specifically thinking the bag drop launch in Calgary? What went into that project on your end?
Well, and I'll let Ryan talk to a lot of it because it was before my time with Embross. But I think number one, it's the demand, right? It's the demand. It's as we were talking earlier, I think COVID played a big part in needing to have a hands-off approach to checking in, to being able to be a lot more self-service and providing a lot more self-service technology than we had before. So number one, just listening to the industry. What are the customers looking for? What are our airline customers looking for? And so, it's a lot of it just is collaboration, talking to the customer, working things out together. And so, there
was a lot of preparation though for this one. Like, obviously Calgary is the flagship for it's flagship Calgary for WestJet, right? And given the size of our operation at that airport, it's not something you want to introduce large amounts of change without thorough preparation, because it can have an outsized impact on the WestJet operation overall. In this case here, I would say, mocks. Like the amount of times that we ran software in parallel with this, which is difficult because both we're using different ways of updating the back-end baggage systems and things like that. But we solved some of those challenges. And then it was over time, it'd be like we'd use one unit, then we'd use two units. We'd work out the kinks on what was the difference or the delta that was between what we expected the application to how it was going to perform versus what we were actually seeing with real world data. And the ability to control like the volume knob on how many you were doing so you weren't being drowned out by the change factor, because that's always, when you're releasing major software changes and things like that, there's always going to be a whole segment of the people who just don't want to change at all.
Of course.
And they will use every means to complain, just, even just changing the color from teal to blue. And so in this one here, you're able to control the volume level of those that can be critically complaining about it. So if you're thinking about, if you're in an airport and it's new and I haven't used it before, I may say something to an agent, I just preferred it the way it was. I just knew what I was doing, things like that. Agents pick up on that, and then you end up with a large volume that comes from the airport, suggesting that maybe there's problems with the software or something like that. It's very important to control that messaging when you're doing major software releases. But for us, it was like a close partnership with WestJet, the Calgary Airport Authority, Embross. But also our organized labor partners at Unifor as well, right? Like, so this was done, like when we were releasing the self-bag drop and changing the self-bag drop software out, like that was done in full concert with them as well. Like they were along for the journey.
Complete partner in the journey. One question that kind of keeps popping up in my head is like, I've seen the evolution up until now, and it's so hard to predict where it's going, but with technology moving so fast, what's next? What's the next generation of self-serve at an airport?
So from a technology perspective and a provider perspective, the next is AI. And of course, AI is big for everybody, right? And so what we're working on right now is for us to build up our AI infrastructure, that information that we have, so that self-service, what's going to happen next is it's intuitively going to know if I place my bag on the self-bag drop belt, it's going to weigh it, it's going to recognize the size of it, it's going to look at the dimensions, it's going to look if the tag is in the right spot, and then so on and so forth. So AI is going to play a big factor in the self-service, especially with self-bag drop.
Right, and I'm assuming you're investing heavily in that.
We are. We are.
And how do you think that's going to affect the experience? Like practically having all that
it'll improve
kind
it.
of data?
It will improve it.
And speed things up, for sure.
And speed things up. Like if you went to Calgary Airport on any given day right now and just sat outside a bag drop for 2 or 3 hours, and watch
I've done
people.
that before.
So have I. And when you watch it, you'll see some people who struggle, right? Like especially if your tag is outside of a readable zone or something like that, and it's hanging off the back, and it's telling the person to move the bag, and they move it, but they're not really certain exactly where they need to do this, or like the AI pieces on that will. Rather than having to just write a series of rules that it's like, okay, this sensor says X, so therefore I have to do Y, or I suggest to the guest that I do Y. This one would be much more accurate on providing real world advice. I'm excited by that. I think if you're going to look at overall in the world, like the biggest challenge in the next year and a half that WestJet is ahead of the curve, because we've already removed payment from the kiosks, is especially in the Canadian market as well. Like right now, you'll start to see that removal. Like these, if you're another air carrier that's out there in Canada and you're using old school magnetic stripe payment type things, you probably have a project underway in order to remove that, and that is going to transform things in North America over the next few years. When you look at Europe, they're already there, right? Like that's already been done and that's already been removed. When it comes to,
they didn't really have a choice in Europe. There's just too many people.
Well, it's also like their financial restrictions on the use of older technologies is more rigid. Canada is middle of the road, and the United States is more of a free for all on what you want to do. But it's the home of freedom. But but it's like when I look at self-service technologies in an airport, what needs to change, and I agree with AI is it, but it's disruption management. Like if you look at anything that happens with airlines now, most people have a good experience with an airline on a good day. Yeah. Like it's like I get from A to B.
Hey, you're going somewhere fun, everything goes smooth. You're happy.
It's disruption that seems worse than it did before COVID. Like just anecdotally when you look at it. large-scale storms or groundings due to strikes or other things like this,
Or the lovely hail that we just
or
had
just
here.
the
Yes.
amazing hail that we had in Calgary. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Those type of things, it creates a massive impact, and you just can't keep up with it. Like, it's not like you can staff a call center to deal with the volumes that you deal with when your entire airline is shut down day to day, right?
You can't plan for IROPS.
You can't.
No.
You cannot plan for things. And it used to be, and maybe this is relate. Like, climate is definitely shifting. Like the volume and of actual major level events like that, it's higher than it was before. We used to probably hit that maybe once every few years before, and it's like now it'll be once or twice a year we have something that happens that catastrophically affects our network, right?
Right.
And that's where the struggle is. And it's not just WestJet. I think it's the same problem in Air Canada, same problem in almost every airline on the planet, is how do we respond to that and how can we ramp those things up? Like AI and applications that are using AI in order to search for things like alternate flight arrangements and things like this, and actually doing the work of getting these people booked as fast as possible onto something. Because it's not like, especially like if you look at the hailstorm, anybody who was here in Calgary that day, you're like, you didn't expect WestJet to get you anywhere.
No.
And
you knew full well, but the person in Winnipeg has no idea what's happening.
But you also wanted communication on what WestJet was going to do for you.
Right.
And that's where, the communication gets there. It just takes a little bit of time. That's where AI and technology has the ability to transform that.
Right, and really make that experience so much better. Yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest challenge is those irregular operations. When you move everything to self-serve, it's tough when you need those custom solutions.
Right.
Yes.
I think too, Chris, the other thing that I didn't mention, so AI is one, I think biometrics and digitalization is another.
Which I saw more in the States than I've ever seen in Canada.
Yes.
So it seems like they're further ahead. It didn't work in the States, the ones I saw very well. But
They haven't adopted, they have it, they have biometrics, but for whatever reason, they're not using it as readily as they should. But digital ID, which is interesting, at the TSA checkpoint, as Ryan mentioned earlier, part of the reason why we're so stuck is because of the regulatory, the TSA, Transportation Security Agency, as well as for international CBP. But what we're finding is that TSA has adopted digitalization in some of the airports. They're kind of using it as a test bed with in Detroit with Delta, and that is the lines go much faster. So passengers are saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't have to stand in this line for 30, 45 minutes. I'm going to miss my flight. But hey, if I opt in, and they have to opt in for digital identification, which means they just check your ID, your face against their ID database, then hey, I can get through this line immediately. And so we're finally seeing it picking up and passengers more readily accepting a biometric or a face type of verification process.
And from a regulatory perspective, that's finally starting to get some acceptance from Transport Canada as well.
Yeah.
Like, that's been the reason for slow to non-existent adoption of biometric technologies in Canada.
which is so funny because Nexus has been around for so long.
Yeah.
And from a traveler point of view, that is the most seamless thing going.
Yep.
And then you hit a bottleneck before and a bottleneck after, and you're like, why isn't this all?
It should be seamless, right? And
I
if
have
anything,
all of my
like,
information in my eye every time I scan it, right?
Like we did, and there is some movement now. Like, there's some trials underway. Air Canada is doing some trials in multiple airports right now with some biometric boarding. WestJet had done some before as well. Like, we were the first airline in Canada to do a large-scale biometrics boarding trial, and for us, that was like our main intent was to overcome some of those regulatory. Like, what we wanted to do was get Transport Canada to look at and say, and to prove like the using biometrics to validate somebody's identification is equal to or greater than from improved security versus using a manual document. And that was that's the good part about that is, like, I'm glad that we did that trial, even though WestJet
Computer doesn't gloss it over.
It doesn't. It's either you or not. Right? Yes or no.
Yeah.
It's all ones and zeros. But but it's allowed those other trials to continue as well. And WestJet, we have a few other priorities on acquisitions of airlines and things like this that we're underway. So we're not participating in the current transport trials related to biometrics, but
Following them closely.
Because that is something, given transport's opening on this, is something that's going to come in Canadian
It will.
airports.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the products we have here is a turn management solution that connects to the aircraft and connects to the operating system. In Embross's case, how closely do you work with reservation systems, or is that more the airline that brings it to you, or are you integrated with Sabre, Amadeus, that kind of thing?
So we do integrate all of our technologies into all of the back-end systems, the DCS, the departure control systems, whether it's Amadeus, whether it's Sabre, whatever it might be. We do have a small application that we can host if, for example, you've got a charter airline or an airline that doesn't have their own DCS, departure control system. We have one that we can provide as well.
Yeah, like for WestJet, it's a little bit different. We don't, our strategy on this is to make the consuming applications, like the front applications that are out there, as dumb as possible. So no business logic, no rules, no nothing inside of those. With WestJet's implementation of the kiosk and bag drop software, like Embross doesn't go to Sabre directly. They come to WestJet series of APIs. So we have APIs that are exposed for airport operations and related to both passenger check-in, baggage issuance, as well as bag drop, and lounge entry and things like that. And that's where Embross comes in. But Embross definitely, like from a product perspective, like they're integrated with any of the major. If you want to go down that route, like for WestJet, it's a little bit different.
Size-wise, it's a little bit different.
It's
I
a
get where
different,
you're saying if you're a smaller competitor, you don't have Orion.
Exactly,
You don't have Orion's department.
Right.
No.
So we do have an application that airlines who don't have one can use. So yeah.
Excellent. And couple last questions for you. How many airports are we operating in for Embross and WestJet at the same time?
It depends, right?
Across Canada yet, or?
Well, it is definitely across Canada, but if we're talking software versus hardware, so Embross offers both hardware and software solutions. WestJet, our proprietary kiosk, which is really just for Abbotsford, is about the only airport that we actually have proprietary hardware anymore.
Shout out to Parm.
Yep. It's
been a frequent podcast guest.
If you're listening, then
one of the forefronts of airports.
Yep. So we have Embross hardware that sits at that airport. The rest of our airports, we use common use
cute terminals
type technologies. So the kiosks themselves, hardware-wise, it's a mix. There are airports we fly to that have Embross, some that have CETA hardware, some that have Materna hardware, everything under the sun. Now, when it comes to application side, WestJet exclusively uses Embross applications for self-bag drop, the tagging, what we call fast tag, which is the kiosk tagging application, and for lounge entry. So the number of airports where, like if we look at kiosks and bag drops that are currently, it's probably about 20 or so airports that WestJet currently operates that software at. And anywhere where it's large. Like if there's an ability to do it, then we do. But the other thing that has to happen, which is different than kiosks in the old days, is like when you have bag drops and things like this, you need a baggage handling system and a baggage reconciliation system in order to make that work. We don't do, because our kiosk application no longer does full service check-in, we don't just plop a kiosk in random airport anymore, because you need a bag drop, because you can't check in on the kiosk. All it does is give you a tag to go to a bag drop. So the amount of airports where we put our software onto a common use kiosk is smaller than it used to be, because we only do that if there's a self bag drop in the airport.
And in terms of our footprint, we're a global
Massive.
provider. Yeah, it's huge. And when you hear of an airport using common use, you can pretty much assure that Embross has at least the hardware perspective in there, the check-in kiosks, the common use, the cute positions that the agents use themselves. When it comes to other technology and service providers that are out there, they could be a competitor of ours, but they don't necessarily manufacture their own hardware. And we've got a fabulous manufacturing facility just outside of Toronto. So we have other providers selling our hardware as part of their
It's an amazing journey when you think they've gone from just pushing a kiosk around a trade floor to being the largest provider of kiosks on the planet.
Well, when you have a good product, good things
That's
happen.
right.
One of our huge goals here with the pod is to tell stories that our listeners might not hear, right? So this has been a fantastic conversation about self-serve. So I'd like to thank you both for coming to spend some time with me today.
Absolutely.
And I look forward to touching base with you in a year and seeing where the future of self-service is.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.